My wife's boss took her from me by force at the company party and kissed her in front of me. Then he looked at me like someone who would look at a disposable employee, and with a dry, arrogant voice, he shot me like a bullet to the chest. Tell him about us. She lowered her head, her eyes wet, and in a whisper as painful as it was disloyal, she said that they were having an affair. The ground didn't leave me. He crushed me. It was as if the world had dropped me from a 10th floor alone, and on impact, everything inside me shattered. I saw, there before me, the woman I swore loved me, to whom I had given the best years of my life, allowing herself to be ripped away from me by a man who didn't even hide his contempt. That party, which should have been just another night of celebration, became the silent wake of my marriage. I didn't react with a scandal. I didn't scream, I didn't push, I didn't cry. It was all internal. A cold fire that burned my nerves, that silenced me on the outside and destroyed me on the inside. I saw colleagues laughing, dancing, drinking, and there I was, static, like an extra in the tragedy of my own life. She couldn't look at me. And he smiled. He smiled like someone who knew he had won, that he had conquered what was mine. And that was worse than any punch. I left in silence, amidst greetings from people who didn't even know what had just happened, but who would soon find out, because my silence wasn't weakness. It was calculation. It was a plan. I got home and looked at her bedside, at the framed pictures, at the letters she had saved, at her perfume lingering on the sheets. I felt disgust. I felt anger. I felt such a violent sadness that I sank to the bedroom floor, my fingers digging into the carpet, trying to grab some part of myself that still made sense. I had been betrayed. Not just as a husband, but as a man, as a human being. They stepped on me, laughed at me, treated me like an old, replaceable part. And there, on that floor, I decided, she would never forget the day she lost me. And he would learn that not all betrayed men bow down. Some rise up. And when they rise up, they make the world tremble. From that moment on, my every move had a purpose. A common divorce would not be enough. No, not for someone who gave everything and received contempt in return. I didn't want to just leave her. I wanted her to feel every second of the emptiness she had caused me. And not with violence, not with scandal. I would do everything with elegance, with intelligence, with a coldness that would cut deeper than any impulsive revenge. Because the pain she had caused me did not deserve just tears, it deserved history. The next day, I sat in front of her with practiced serenity, my eyes fixed, my words sharp. I told her she was free, that she could be happy with him, but that I would leave that relationship like no one else had ever left before. She cried. She tried to justify it. She said it was confusing, that she hadn't planned it, that she just wanted to feel alive. I didn't answer. I just watched. I watched like someone watching a building slowly collapse, savoring every crack. I'm going to give you this divorce, I said, but you'll remember me every second you breathe next to him. She thought it was just a sentence. Little did she know what was coming next. The boss, arrogant as ever, thought he had won. He sent indirect messages to the company, looked at me with that smile on the corner of his mouth, like someone collecting human trophies. But the game hadn't started yet. Behind the scenes, I was already moving my pieces. I kept quiet. I kept working. Pretending to be normal. But while he was distracted by the victory, I was gathering allies, information, documents, details that would soon become his downfall. And more than that, while he was stealing my wife, I was conquering something much greater. It was through an informal meeting with a senior executive at the headquarters that I discovered the opportunity that would change everything. The company was undergoing restructuring and was looking for a new leader for the international branch. I saw the opportunity and grabbed it with my teeth. I invested everything. I presented ideas, results, proposals. I was heard. I was considered. And before I knew it, I was already being considered for a position that would put everyone below me, including him. She didn't know it. Neither did he. But while they savored the betrayal, I was planning a promotion. And then fate, or perhaps the irony of the universe, introduced me to someone. A strong, elegant woman, with an intelligence that crossed the room when she spoke. She was the CEO's daughter. Yes, that same CEO he so flattered and feared. We started talking by chance, out of professional affinity, through exchanges about management and innovation. But there was something there. A respect, an admiration, and little by little, something more. It wasn't forced. It wasn't planned. It was genuine. And while my ex-wife was bogged down in a relationship that was born out of error, I was reborn in a love that grew with dignity. The day I was named the new CEO was the same day he was demoted for misconduct and questionable ethical performance. He tried to resist, he tried to appeal, but it was too late. The evidence was in his hands. And when he came into the room to figure out what was going on, he found me sitting in the chair he thought would one day be his. I looked at him and said, "Now, tell her about us. About who you are. Because she deserves to know who she's sleeping with." He didn't answer. She cried. But in that moment, I no longer felt anger. I felt justice. The internal press reported it. The company has restructured itself. And I, with the support of those who previously ignored me, built a new phase of my life, with someone by my side who looked at me as if I were whole, not a spare part. My ex-wife came to me, asked for forgiveness, said she regretted it. I heard her. I respected your pain. But I didn't come back. Because what she killed in me at that party would never be reborn by her side. And now when I look back, I don't see any more pain. I see the price you pay for playing with someone who only wants to love. I see the weight of truth crushing the lies told in whispers. I see the fall of those who thought they could do anything and the rise of those who decided to rebuild themselves from scratch. But what really changed everything, what really gave meaning to every step of my revenge, was what I discovered that last night, when I was called to an emergency council meeting, and heard something that even I hadn't expected. Something that directly links my new partner to the past I've tried to bury. Something that changes everything I thought I knew about my history, and about who I really am. What is she hiding? And why, even after everything, do I feel like I still don't know the end of this story? Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support, encourage or romanticize cheating, on the contrary. All the stories you hear are fictional, but based on real and possible situations, with a single objective, show how betrayal destroys lives, corrupts homes and leaves deep scars. Get ready now to dive into another story shocking, intense and unforgettable. Take a deep breath, the truth always takes its toll. Daniel had always been a reserved man, with calm manners and a way of seeing the world that mixed rationality and dedication. She had worked for more than 10 years in the financial sector of a large multinational and, despite the intense routine, she never stopped prioritizing what she considered her true achievement, her marriage to Elena. The two met in college, she was studying communications and he was studying administration. It wasn't an explosive and chaotic love, but a bond that was built in comfortable silences, long conversations and looks that said more than declarations. Elena had a subtle charm, something that mixed elegance and sweetness, a woman who didn't need to raise her voice to be heard. She was intelligent, articulate, and had a way of observing others with sincere attention. During their first years together, they shared dreams in a small apartment, living the joy of those who are content with little, because they have each other. Over time, Elena grew in her career. She rose from junior copywriter to communications manager at one of the largest marketing companies in the country. She was admired by her colleagues, respected by her leaders and surrounded by a team that looked up to her. Daniel followed every step with pride, encouraging the boldest decisions, rooting for every promotion. She, in turn, knew she could count on him in every phase, from the tiredness of a difficult day to the nights when the fear of failure weighed more heavily than plans. They were accomplices. Or at least, that's what they seemed to be. Their life together fit into a well-aligned routine, coffee together in the morning, hurried goodbyes at the door, messages throughout the day, home-cooked dinners with wine on the weekends and a few trips to escape the rush. Friends saw them as an example. Family admired them as an ideal couple. Elena had a keen sense of aesthetics, was vain in the right measure, liked fresh flowers in the house, books on human behavior, and listening to French music while cooking. Daniel, more introspective, felt comfortable in his universe of spreadsheets and reports, but he observed her with silent admiration, as if he knew he lived next to someone rare. He was not romantic in the traditional sense, but he showed love in gestures, taking care of her car, remembering to refill her favorite chocolates, making her tea without her asking when he saw her tired. He never lacked respect or affection. Even though the years had brought a certain automatism, they seemed to maintain a bond of mutual respect that many couples lose over time. It was during one of these periods of greater stability that Elena's company announced a restructuring. With it came a new name to head up the marketing department, a director with vast international experience, known for his bold vision and charismatic profile. His name was Adam. From the first introduction, he made a strong impression. Young for the position he held, he spoke confidently, used bold metaphors and had an engaging demeanor that captured the attention of everyone in the room. Elena, accustomed to dealing with technical and difficult-to-approach leaders, saw a different type of person in Adam. He listened, instigated, praised accurately and asked questions that provoked reflection. It was clear that he knew how to navigate the corporate environment like a conductor conducting an orchestra. Adam began to delegate important responsibilities to Elena, recognizing her talent and giving her autonomy to make decisions that previously had to be handled by several hierarchies. In a short time, the dynamic between the two became clear to the team. They worked together more frequently, and the extended meetings were not unusual. On the contrary, they seemed to yield significant results. Daniel listened to stories about his new boss with the enthusiasm typical of someone who believes in the competence of the woman he loves. He thought it was good to see her valued. He never showed jealousy or even raised questions. Perhaps out of trust, perhaps because he could not imagine any other possibility beyond the solid partnership they had built. The changes at the company brought more trips, events and get-togethers. Elena, now more exposed to social corporate environments, started to have a busier schedule. Daniel, even though he missed having her around more, didn't complain. He was mature enough to understand the challenges of a career on the rise. On the nights when she came home late, he would leave the living room light on and fall asleep on the couch with a book open on his chest. The following mornings, he would wake up to a light kiss from her and a ready-made coffee. Everything seemed to flow, even though a small, silent abyss began to form between them. What used to be spontaneous became mechanical. Dinner conversations became reports on commitments, deadlines and strategies. Weekends were taken up with pending tasks, calls that couldn't wait or urgent meetings with the team. Daniel felt it, but he didn't say it. He tried to convince himself that it was just a phase, that everything would soon go back to the way it was before. When he suggested short trips or simple plans for the two of them, he heard promises that were postponed. And when she finally accepted, her mind was always elsewhere. In an attempt to keep what they had alive, he began to dedicate more time to the house, to preparing discreet surprises, like little notes in her bag or playlists with songs that marked the beginning of their relationship. However, these small attempts rarely received proportional attention. Even so, Daniel continued to believe that they were fine. That love resisted, even though suffocated by time. Birthdays were still celebrated, gifts were still exchanged. And there were still moments of laughter, affection, and complicity. But they were rarer, almost like memories of a recent past that insisted on slipping through our fingers. From the outside, the couple appeared intact. Inside the house, there was silence. Not the comfortable feeling of someone who shares peace, but the discomfort of someone who has a lot to say and doesn't know how to start. There were nights when Daniel watched her sleep, searching for traces of the woman he had fallen in love with. And I saw. But I also saw a distance. A space he no longer knew how to fill. Elena, on the other hand, was experiencing an emotional and professional effervescence. She felt challenged, recognized, heard. She saw in Adam's eyes a reflection of herself that she had not seen for a long time. It was as if he saw her through a lens that Daniel, immersed in his daily struggles, had stopped using. She felt more alive, more desired, more interesting. And this feeling, although subtle, began to change her priorities, even if she herself did not want to admit it. Marriage was still important. But what she experienced in the meeting rooms, on trips, in the smiles exchanged during presentations and in the lingering glances, was a different excitement, one that challenged her internal limits. She had not yet crossed the line, but she was approaching it with increasingly confident steps. The culmination of the company's new phase came with the announcement of a grand end-of-year party, which promised to bring together employees from several branches. The event would be held at an elegant resort, with an intense program, speeches by key leaders, and moments of celebration planned down to the last detail. Elena was responsible for part of the organization, along with Adam. They spent weeks involved in details, presentations, and institutional materials. Expectations were high. Daniel, always discreet, saw no reason to participate, but when he saw her excitement, he decided to go with her. He wanted to support her, be there, and perhaps try to reconnect with the ties that were weakening. He believed that this could be a new beginning. On the eve of the party, Elena seemed restless. She took care of her hair, nails and clothes with unusual attention. Daniel noticed, but didn't comment. He felt a pang of distance, but tried to ignore it. He thought maybe he was overreacting. On the way to the event, she spoke little. He played his cell phone frequently. He stared out the car window, trying to calm the whirlwind of feelings that were beginning to build. Upon arrival, they were greeted with smiles, lights and music. Everything seemed to be in place. But there was something in the air. A climate that Daniel couldn't name. As if his story was about to split into before and after. And he still had no idea what was coming. The night of the party arrived shrouded in silent tension. The ambience was elegant, lit by soft, warm lights, and every detail seemed to have been thought out to impress. Daniel walked beside Elena through decorated hallways, smiling faces, and subtly exaggerated toasts, as if the company's success could be measured by the glasses raised. While he discreetly observed the details, she stood out among the guests. Her colleagues approached her with enthusiasm, leaders greeted her with respect, and Adam, with his magnetic presence, seemed to orbit around her with a constancy that was hard to ignore. Daniel, although proud, was beginning to feel something uncomfortable. It was a subtle but uncomfortable sensation, as if there was a code in play that he was unable to decipher. The glances that crossed between Elena and the director seemed to cross professional boundaries, but they were always accompanied by formal words, neutral smiles, and calculated distances. Still, there was something behind the body language, a pulsating subtext that Daniel could no longer ignore. As the speeches began, he tried to focus on the words of thanks, the goals achieved, the praise for the team, but his mind wandered. He remembered the nights he saw her arrive home tired from work, the early mornings when she said she was finishing reports, and the messages that were too short for the days that were too long. He began to put the pieces together, still without forming any image, only with the growing discomfort of someone who senses that something is out of place. When Elena was called to the stage to receive a leadership award, she was applauded. Daniel applauded sincerely, although the smile she wore was not as complete as it used to be. She seemed confident, radiant, as if she belonged there more than anywhere else. And when Adam took the stage shortly after, his speech highlighted Elena with enthusiasm beyond protocol. And it was in that brief moment that Daniel realized what he had denied until then. The sparkle in his eyes when he mentioned her was not institutional. And the slight blush on her face when she was praised was not just shyness. After the event, the guests spread out among the resort's leisure areas. Daniel tried to stay close, but Elena always seemed 2 steps ahead, involved in conversations, posing for photos, being called here and there. At one point, when he looked for her, he saw her in a more private corner with Adam. There was no touching, but her body was leaning slightly toward him and the two seemed to be talking quietly, laughing complicitly. When she saw him, she interrupted the moment naturally, walking over to him with the excuse that she was discussing details of the next quarter's campaign. Daniel pretended to accept, but something inside him had already broken. The trust, even without concrete proof, began to slowly crumble. That night, he went back to his room early, while Elena was still walking around the party, saying she would stay a little longer to socialize. Alone in the suite, he lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling for hours, feeling invisible in a life that he himself had built. In the following days, something changed. Daniel began to observe more closely, noticing absences that he previously filled with his own explanations. He began to mentally question the times, the silences, the details of the clothes, the different perfumes. He didn't comment on anything, nor did he confront anyone. It just accumulated. Elena, on the other hand, seemed oblivious to his uneasiness. He continued with the same routine, with the same automatic speech about commitments and deadlines. But there was a different glow on her face, as if something inside her was awakening. A new kind of energy that escaped even when I tried to hide it. Sometimes he found himself smiling at his cell phone. In others, he would retreat to another room in the house to make calls. Daniel wasn't the invasive type. It never was. But at that point it was no longer about jealousy, it was about emotional survival. It was on a normal Friday night that the wound finally opened. Elena's company had organized an informal thank you dinner, just for a few managers and their companions. Adam would be there, and Elena insisted that Daniel accompany her. He agreed, even though he didn't want to. He wanted to see more. He needed to understand what his eyes hadn't yet captured. The restaurant was sophisticated, with low lights, background music, and long tables. They arrived together, but Elena was soon surrounded by colleagues. Daniel sat next to her, trying to join in the conversation, but it was as if they were speaking a language he didn't understand. Adam arrived a few minutes later, greeting everyone with that expansive manner. When he reached the table, he extended his hand to Daniel with a polite smile, but it didn't take long for him to fix his gaze on Elena in a way that made his stomach turn. During dinner, their glances between them were quick but intense. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up her glass. Adam, for his part, maintained an air of someone who knew more than he was saying. When dinner was over, some guests went to the hotel bar, while others said their goodbyes. Elena suggested they stay a little longer. Daniel, silent, just nodded. The atmosphere at the bar was more relaxed. Laughter, clinking glasses, more upbeat music. Adam joined them again and soon proposed a toast to the year's results. Everyone toasted. And it was at that moment, amidst the distraction of the others and the collective drunkenness, that it happened. Adam, quickly and subtly, ran his hand naturally across Elena's back. A touch too intimate for the environment, too intimate for any colleague. Daniel saw it. And saw nothing else. It was as if the world had shrunk to that gesture. There was no way to pretend. There was no way to justify it. She instinctively looked at Daniel right away, as if she felt she had been caught in the act. But he said nothing. He just got up and left. She found him later in the bedroom, where he was already sitting on the edge of the bed, his shirt open, his hands clasped together, and his eyes fixed on the floor. Elena tried to start a conversation as if nothing had happened, but he interrupted with a simple question, "How long has it been?" She remained silent. For a few seconds, only the sound of the air conditioning filled the space. Then, in a barely audible voice, she confessed. She said she hadn't wanted it, that she hadn't planned it, that everything had happened amidst the confusion of routine, mutual admiration, and unspoken need. Daniel listened to her in silence, like someone watching a fire without knowing where to start putting it out. She tried to justify it, tried to soften it, but each word seemed to only confirm what had already been destroyed. At the end of the confession, he stood up, calmly put on his jacket, grabbed his car keys and, without looking back, simply said, "Your story begins today. Ours ends here." Elena tried to reach him, but he had already left. In the elevator, as it slowly descended, Daniel did not cry. He did not scream. He did not break anything. There was such a dense emptiness inside him that nothing seemed to hurt anymore. It was not just the end of a marriage. It was the end of a construction, of a narrative, of an entire life shaped alongside someone who, in the end, chose the other path. But what Elena didn't know yet was that Daniel wouldn't be coming home the next day, and that his silence was actually the harbinger of something much bigger. Because that betrayal, although it was the breaking point, was not yet the climax of the story. What would come next, would change everything. The week after the revelation of the betrayal was marked by a silence that seemed to stretch time. Elena tried to contact him with long and short messages, phone calls, and voice messages with a trembling voice, but no response. Daniel remained absent, not only physically, but in every layer of his presence. He was not at home, he did not show up at work, and he had not returned to his usual social circle. His absence was strategic. While everyone waited for an emotional scandal, he was immersed in a detailed, meticulous plan, silently planned behind the scenes of the same company where everything began to fall apart. But, above all, Daniel was not just running away from the pain, he was positioning himself. Using the time that Elena filled with regret to prepare something that transcended common revenge. There would be no screaming. There would be impact. And the first step of this turnaround was about to happen. On the night of the big announcement of the company's restructuring, Elena arrived at the main auditorium feeling a mix of anxiety and exhaustion. Rumors had been pointing to drastic changes in leadership, and as Adam's right-hand woman on recent projects, she felt that something important was about to happen. Adam met her backstage at the event with that same confident smile. He told her that the changes would be good for everyone, that he trusted in what they had built, and that she should just smile and watch. But there was something strange in the way he spoke, as if he were trying to control a situation that was slipping through his fingers. Elena, still shaken by the recent events with Daniel, tried to maintain her composure. She needed to show strength, even though her heart was in ruins. The auditorium was full. Executives, investors, regional directors. A large screen displayed the slogan for the company's new phase, Transformation with Purpose. The lights slowly dimmed and a presenter took the stage, thanking everyone for coming. After a few corporate videos and impactful numbers, the anticipation grew until the main announcement. The name of the new global CEO would be revealed that night. Adam straightened his jacket, preparing to receive the recognition he felt he deserved. But then the presenter continued, with a gleam of surprise in his eyes, as if he were about to share news that no one there had expected. With a theatrical gesture, he called the new nominee for international leadership onto the stage. And then, the name that appeared on the screen was not Adam's. It was Daniel's. A heavy silence fell over the room, as if for a second the air had been removed from the room. Elena's eyes widened, her body frozen, while Adam let out a nervous laugh, thinking it was some kind of mistake. But it wasn't. Daniel entered the stage with firm steps, impeccable suit, cold eyes. Scattered applause began to emerge, at first timid, then more enthusiastic. Most people in the room were unaware of the details of the personal drama between the three, but Daniel's figure there, in that position, at that moment, was too powerful to go unnoticed. He thanked them briefly, without beating around the bush, and then, after a few minutes, his tone changed. He said he believed in transparent leadership, in ethical reconstruction, and that in recent months he had conducted a silent audit on behalf of the board, investigating conduct incompatible with the company's values. He mentioned internal manipulations, favors disguised as meritocracy, and inappropriate interpersonal relationships within the corporate structure. Without naming names, but with words as sharp as razors, Daniel exposed the behind-the-scenes of a management that had become corrupt under the guise of success. Each sentence was measured, firm, impossible to dispute. The blow was clear. And it was elegant. Adam, sitting in the front row, was sweating. Elena was barely breathing. At the end of the presentation, the board took the microphone and announced that, effective that day, Adam would be removed from all duties, based on the confidential reports that had been submitted to the compliance department. There was no time to react. Security guards approached discreetly and asked him to accompany them. Adam tried to resist verbally, demanding explanations, saying that it was absurd. But it was no use. His voice, which had been so powerful until then, sounded pathetic amidst the embarrassment. He was removed from the room in front of everyone, as a symbol of what happens to those who confuse power with impunity. Elena watched the scene without being able to react. She was paralyzed by a mixture of shock, shame and something she could not yet name. After the event, Daniel didn't leave. He stayed in the building, greeting strategic allies, starting his new phase with absolute control of the narrative. When he finally crossed paths with Elena in the hallway, there was no greeting. She called him by name, but he only stared at her for a few seconds before saying he needed to talk to her. Not here. He asked her to be at Adam's old office the next day, which now belonged to him. And then he turned and left. Elena spent the night awake. She felt fear, guilt, but also curiosity. What had Daniel discovered? How had he managed to do all that so quickly? She knew he was smart, but she had no idea he was capable of turning the tables with such precision. The next morning, Elena arrived at his office with her heart pounding. She knocked on the door, and Daniel told her to come in a low voice. The room was quiet, decorated in a sober manner. There was a new air there. A new energy. Daniel was behind his desk, looking out the window, his back to her. When he turned around, there was no anger in his eyes. There was something colder, more resolute. He asked her to sit down. And then, with the calm of someone rehearsing every syllable, he revealed something she never expected to hear. He said that, weeks before the party, he had received an anonymous email with an encrypted attachment. At first, she thought it was blackmail or a scam. But when she opened the files with the help of an IT consultant, she discovered something that changed everything. He showed her the screenshots and recordings of calls that not only involved conversations between Adam and Elena, but also internal documents that proved that Adam had used her name as a bridge to manipulate decisions and gain access to accounts that belonged to other directors. She didn't know. At least, not in that way. But the most shocking part was yet to come. Daniel walked to a drawer, took out a red folder and placed it on the table. He said that the audit he had conducted also revealed the identity of the sender of the anonymous email. It was an employee of the legal department, but the detail that changed the whole story was the reason that made her act. Elena couldn't imagine. Until Daniel told her the woman's name, Sophia. And finally, what she revealed, Sophia was the daughter of one of the company's founders, now deceased, who had been unfairly dismissed years ago after being accused of fraud by none other than Adam. And Adam, in turn, had built his career on the ruins of this man's reputation. Adam's betrayal was old. And now, for the first time, the tables were turned. Sophia sought out Daniel because she knew he had integrity. Because she discovered, when searching through the old board's files, that Elena's name had been used as bait to justify new suspicious movements. Elena, upon hearing that, turned pale. I couldn't process it. Daniel continued. He said he didn't hate her. It hurt, yes, but at the moment of betrayal he knew he didn't want blind revenge. I wanted her to see with her own eyes what it was really like to be on the other side. And, more than that, I wanted to show the world that the betrayed can also be the strategist. That silence can be a strength, not a weakness. Elena didn't know what to say. Tears flowed uncontrollably. She asked why he didn't tell her sooner, why he let it get to that point. Daniel simply replied that some truths need to happen at the right time. Because the impact is not just in what is revealed, but in how and when it is revealed. And then, before she left, he said something that hit her like a final blow. He revealed that he was now in a relationship with Sophia. That their bond had started professionally, but had grown from shared pain and mutual admiration. That she, unlike Elena, had come into his life to add to it, not to divide it. Elena, devastated, left the office, exhausted. The betrayal she had committed was only the beginning. Adam's downfall, the exposure of his lies, and now the ultimate loss of Daniel to someone born of the same plot she had helped destroy, it all came together. And finally, she understood what it meant to lose not just a love, but the respect of those who knew you through and through. Elena left the office without a specific destination. The hallway you had walked down so many times now looked different. The walls, the doors, the familiar faces became just shadows in a reality that no longer made sense. She walked straight, trying to keep her balance, but her legs felt shaky, as if something inside her was collapsing in slow motion. He couldn't organize his thoughts, as if all the words he heard from Daniel were echoing simultaneously, without hierarchy, without logic. Sophia's name was ringing in his head, not only because she was the woman Daniel had started over with, but because of everything she represented in that story. Elena, who had always believed she had control over situations, now faced the crushing weight of realizing she had been just a cog, vulnerable, predictable, and replaceable. She sat on the bench closest to the company's outdoor garden, watching the cars come and go and trying to take a deep breath, but the air felt too heavy. While she sank into a silent pit of regret, Daniel remained in his office, staring out the window at the city with a calm that hid the intensity of the journey he had traveled up until that point. Nothing about it had been easy. Accepting the pain, keeping it silent, investigating, planning, getting back on his feet, it had all been a solitary climb, sustained only by the certainty that he deserved more than what had been imposed on him. It wasn't about revenge for wounded pride, but about a search for the restoration of his dignity, his identity. Loving someone deeply and being betrayed so unfairly had brought him in touch with a side of himself that he never imagined existed, a man capable of confronting a system, of rebuilding his own narrative, and of taking control of what had previously seemed impossible to control. At the end of that same day, Daniel left the company building without warning. He went down through the underground parking lot, got into his car, and drove to a discreet cafe on the other side of the city. Sophia was already waiting for him at a table in the back, facing a window overlooking a small park. When he saw her, he smiled lightly, the kind of smile that no longer carried pain, but relief. He sat down across from her, took her hand naturally, and the two remained silent for a few seconds, as if they didn't need to say anything to understand the magnitude of what they had built. Sophia had been much more than an ally. She listened to him without judgment, encouraged him without self-interest, supported him when no one else could see the truth behind the mask that Adam wore. But what brought them together most was the lack of rush, the construction without demands, the connection that emerged amidst the ruins and yet flourished. "Are you okay?" she asked, still keeping her hands over his. Daniel took a while to respond. He observed the soft features of her face, her steady eyes, her steady breathing. It was strange to feel at peace after so much chaos. "I am, for the first time in a long time, I am." And her? She understood. Or at least she saw enough to know that there was no more room for us. And that was all I needed. Sophia nodded. There was no trace of vanity on her face, no celebration of what might have seemed like a victory over Elena. She knew this story was much bigger than a love triangle. It was about redemption, about justice, about rescue. The next morning, Daniel's name was all over the internal communications. The company's social media was full of congratulatory messages, repercussions of Adam's dismissal, and speculation about the restructuring. The news also leaked to business websites, and some portals began talking about the surprising turnaround of a discreet executive. Elena read it all on her cell phone, sitting on her bed, still not daring to go to work. The words were like needles. With each reading, she felt more distant from what she was. Now she was part of a public story, even without her name being mentioned. People commented, judged, and gave their opinions. And she had no way of defending herself, because the truth was too raw and unvarnished to find any justification. Later that day, Elena made an impulsive decision. He went to Daniel's apartment. The doorman recognized her, hesitated for a second, but let her go up. She didn't know exactly what she wanted. Maybe ask for forgiveness again. Maybe say I still loved him. Or maybe just face head on the reality that he insisted on denying. He knocked on the door with restrained force. Daniel opened it, surprised, but didn't show anger. I just needed, she began, but lost her words. Come in. He finished, moving away to make room. She stepped inside. The apartment was different. There were new paintings on the walls, flowers on the table, books she didn't recognize. It was as if he had redesigned his own home. Elena stood in the center of the room, trying to find a foothold. I read everything. I saw how you turned the situation around, how you rebuilt everything. Her voice wavered. You did what I would never have been able to do. And I don't know how to go on with my life knowing that I was the breaking point. Daniel listened to her attentively. Then he walked to the kitchen, got 2 glasses of water and handed one to her. You weren't the breaking point, Elena. You were the consequence of many small choices that kept us apart for years. You made a mistake, yes. But I also ignored it. I accepted too much silence, I settled too much. But when you crossed a line of no return, I had to move. For the first time, I chose myself. And I'm not going to give that up now. Elena sat on the sofa, placed the glass on the table and stared at him with teary eyes. Are you really with her? Yes, he answered without hesitation, but not as revenge. Sophia sees me. Respects me. Listens to me. And I don't need to be more than I am to be with her. Elena closed her eyes for a moment. A tear silently flowed down. And me? How do I start over? Just like me, one step at a time. Facing what is real. Correcting what can be corrected. And living what is left with honesty. Silence fell. But it was different. It was no longer the uncomfortable silence of grief. It was the silence of acceptance. She stood up, picked up her bag, and walked to the door. Before she left, she looked at him one last time. I loved you, Daniel. Even though I made so many mistakes, I loved you. I know. And because it was love. I won't hold a grudge. But I won't go back either. She nodded, opened the door, and walked away. As he left, he felt something strange. It was no relief. It wasn't despair. It was just the end. In the days that followed, life resumed its course with new contours. Daniel took on the role permanently, remodeled teams, and strengthened internal values. Sophia became more present, not only in his life, but also in the company's new projects. Little by little, the two of them built something solid, based on everything they had experienced, not just the pain, but the strength that emerges after it. Elena resigned shortly after. She said she needed to start over, far from all that. She moved to another city, began giving lectures on corporate ethics and interpersonal relationships. She started therapy, reconnected with old friends, and finally began writing about her own story. Not as a victim, but as someone who understood the impact of her own choices. Years later, the three would go their separate ways. But one truth would remain clear to all of them: betrayal is not just an emotional mistake. It is an abyss where you lose what is most intimate in yourself and in others. And whoever survives this is never the same again. Some become bitter. Others, bigger. Daniel chose to be bigger. And perhaps it was this choice that made him unforgettable. The month that followed the final conversation between Daniel and Elena was marked by a kind of silent reorganization. Not of the company, which had already been officially restructured, but of the lives of each of them. It was as if each piece, after the storm, was slowly finding its place. But there was no rest. The emotions that came after were not light. There was no room for complete relief, because each movement was still permeated by the recent memory of what had been lost, what had been revealed, and what had been rebuilt with pain. Daniel spent his days in meetings, reformulating processes, closely monitoring each new decision, not for control, but because he now understood the weight of the responsibility he carried. He was the man leading a company that had almost been destroyed by vanity and abuse of power, and he did not want to make the mistake of allowing that to happen again, not under his leadership, nor under anyone else's. He carried with him the constant feeling of being at a crossroads where each choice shaped the future of dozens of people, and no longer just his own. The relationship with Sophia, which until then had remained discreet, began to reveal itself in a more organic way. He invited her to small events, more informal meetings, and even the most conservative colleagues recognized that there was something legitimate there, something that could not be ignored or reduced to a timely romance. She did not occupy strategic positions, was not promoted based on proximity, nor did she use her relationship to gain space. His presence beside Daniel was serene, firm, almost silent, but visible. What was disturbing, however, was not his new relationship, but the brutal contrast between what he had built and what Elena now faced. The social circle that had once surrounded her was beginning to unravel. Former colleagues avoided contact, some out of embarrassment, others out of fear of associating themselves with someone marked by a scandal that, although not officially public, had spread through the corridors and backstage like a legend that was taking on increasingly clear contours. She, in turn, struggled with a type of pain that was not just the loss of a love, but of the identity she once held. She was no longer the admired professional, the exemplary wife, the woman who moved elegantly between the personal and professional spheres. It was now the center of an uncomfortable memory, a kind of living scar in the memory of a structure that was trying to prove to the world that it could be reborn from its own failures. No matter how hard she tried to get back on her feet, she found closed doors, sideways glances, and a constant feeling of being evaluated based on a single decision. This weakened her, but it also challenged her. He began to frequent smaller spaces, local companies, small consultancies, offering training, lectures, sharing his experience no longer as a model of success, but as someone who knew the downfall from within. He didn't play the victim, but he didn't run away from his responsibilities either. She was direct, sometimes even too hard on herself, but there was something authentic in the way she positioned herself now. For the first time, perhaps, Elena spoke without the desire to please, only with the intention of warning. Daniel learned of her movements through mutual acquaintances, but did not seek her out. She felt that any interference would be a way of denying her the possibility of starting over with autonomy. He still cared about what she did, but now in a distant, respectful way, as if he were observing the journey of another life that no longer belonged to him. And it was in this distance that he began to face a new phase of his own existence. He started visiting his mother more, who had always been discreet about her opinion of Elena. He reconnected with old friends, took up forgotten hobbies like photography again, and once, during a work trip, decided to extend his stay for a few more days, exploring small towns and taking portraits of strangers. These small decisions, which seemed random, were creating in him a new perception of time, affection, and freedom. He no longer felt trapped by the label of the betrayed or the avenger. He was now someone who carried an intense history, yes, but who did not let that history define his future choices. One night, at an intimate dinner with Sophia, the two talked about what they had been building. She looked at him calmly, with that look that seemed to see beyond the surface, and asked if he had really left everything behind. Daniel took a while to respond. He thought about Elena, he thought about Adam, he thought about himself first and foremost. And then he answered sincerely, no. That forgetting was not possible. That there was still a vivid memory of all that, but that it no longer hurt in the same way. That now, when I remembered it, it was like rewatching a film that left an impression, but that no longer interferes in the present. Sophia smiled tenderly, held his hand and said that was enough. That she never wanted an intact man, but an honest man with his scars. And in that moment, without promises, without grand plans, they both understood that they were ready for whatever came next. But before the story could find its final resolution, one last piece of the puzzle was set in motion. An unexpected invitation arrived in Daniel's inbox. It was an international seminar on leadership and business transformation, and Elena's name appeared among the invited speakers. She had been nominated by an independent organization that had no knowledge of her more intimate corporate past. The nomination was based on the projects she had been leading in entrepreneurial communities, and especially on a series of articles she had written on ethical errors and emotional responsibility in modern leadership. Her name was now circulating again, but for a new reason. Daniel read the schedule, closed his computer, and remained silent for a few minutes. He could ignore it. He could simply not go. But something inside him told him that there was still something to be done. On the day of the event, she entered the auditorium discreetly, sat in the back rows and watched without being noticed. Elena came up on stage with a different posture than she usually had. She spoke with less exuberance, but with more truth. She told her story without compromising details, but made it clear that she spoke from the place of someone who had fallen. She spoke about ego, about emotional neglect, about decisions that seem small at first but that, when added together, destroy careers and affections. She did not ask for forgiveness. She did not seek applause. She just spoke. At the end of the talk, she received a timid but genuine applause. And then she stepped down from the stage, meeting Daniel's gaze for a brief second. He did not smile. He just looked at her respectfully, as if to say, without words, that he understood. After the event, they did not meet. There were no pending conversations, no reconciliatory hugs. Each went their own way, knowing that they had concluded something important with just that look. A mutual recognition that the story between them was over, but that the learning would continue to reverberate for a long time. And at that point, the attentive listener would know, the true consequence of betrayal is not only in the immediate pain, but in the transformation it provokes, in the bridges it burns and in the new paths it forces to build. Because some loves end with screams, others with silence, and the deepest ones, with a last look full of everything that was left unsaid. The morning after the seminar, Daniel woke up before his alarm clock rang. He opened his eyes silently, still in the dim light of the room, and lay there for long minutes, feeling the soft weight of Sophia's breathing beside him. The apartment was plunged into a comforting stillness, but his mind remained agitated. There was something latent, not regret, nor doubt, but a residual presence from that previous night, as if the visual encounter with Elena had reopened a door he thought was already locked. It wasn't pain, it was an echo. A distant sound from a past life that insisted on reminding him that it existed, that it was real, that it left its mark. He got up slowly, put on his slippers, walked to the kitchen and made a strong coffee, watching the steam rise as the aroma filled the air. He took a sip and leaned against the counter, taking a deep breath. There was no guilt. But there was an urgent need to understand what, exactly, still needed to be closed. Throughout that week, Daniel focused on his work more than usual. He started meetings with new international partners, reviewed projects that were in the expansion phase, and traveled for 2 days to finalize details with a group of investors. During these activities, Sophia was generously present, participating when invited, but without intruding, understanding with maturity the internal time he needed to work through. One night when he returned from his trip, he found a handwritten note from her on the table: "Not everything that ends badly needs to continue to hurt. If there is still something to say, say it. If not, live in peace. I am not here to replace anyone. I am here because I want to stay." He smiled, closed his eyes for a moment, and knew he was with the right person. But that also made him understand that there was still an emotional wound pulsing somewhere. And not because of Sophia, nor because of unresolved love. It was something else. A last conversation that, no matter how much he avoided it, still needed to happen. 2 weeks later, on a gray, rainy afternoon, Daniel contacted Elena. His tone was direct and unsentimental: "We need to talk. No past, no accusations. Just closure." She responded within minutes with a simple, "Yes. Tell me when and where." He chose a discreet café, far from the places they had frequented together, in a neutral neighborhood. He arrived before her and sat near the window. When she came in, she was wearing no makeup, her hair was tied up in a casual bun, and her clothes were simple, elegant but not ostentatious. She sat across from him and waited. There was no tension in her eyes, just an old weariness mixed with a certain dignity. She was there because she understood that she needed to be. Neither of them knew quite how to begin. Daniel broke the silence first, with a question that seemed to have been polished for weeks. Do you really understand what you did to our history? Elena kept her eyes fixed on him for a few seconds before answering, in a low but firm voice, yes. And it's not just about the physical betrayal, I know that now. It was about walking away from you without saying anything. About letting myself be carried away by a fleeting admiration, by a childish need to be validated, when everything I needed was right next to me, and I didn't know how to see it. He nodded slightly, as if receiving an expected answer, but one that still hurts. He continued, without harshness, just clearly, what hurt the most wasn't losing you. It was realizing that you were willing to lose me without a fight. As if our past had less weight than the newness of someone like Adam. Elena lowered her eyes, bit her lip, and was silent for a moment before answering. At that moment, I no longer recognized myself. I thought I had lost you long before. And when I realized that I still loved you, I had already done everything wrong. He sighed, rested his hands on the table and said, I'm not here for answers. I just needed to hear you say it. Because, as much as I've moved on, as much as I've rebuilt myself, there was always a part of me that wanted to know if you knew, if you really knew what you destroyed. She took a deep breath, and placed her hands on the table too, but without touching his. Her gaze was clear now, without pleading. Just a kind of mature presence, as if she were ready to listen to anything. Daniel continued, calmer, today I'm fine. I'm with someone who respects me, who sees me as I am. But that doesn't erase who we were. I'll never forget. Not because it still hurts, but because it shaped me. It molded me. And despite everything, thank you. Elena was surprised, and her eyes filled with tears without her wanting them to. Thank you. He smiled sideways, almost ironically, yes. Because only by going through all this did I learn the value of choosing myself. Of respecting myself. And maybe, if none of this had happened, I would still be trying to save something that no longer existed. She ran her hand over her eyes, nodded, and after a while she answered calmly, I loved you, Daniel. I swear I loved you. But it was an immature version of love. Today I understand that love is presence. And I was absence. He looked at her for long seconds, and then simply answered, now we are two adults who know what they don't want to repeat. They stood up together. No hug. No touch. Just one last look, as if they had finally released each other from any remaining weight. As he left the cafe, Daniel felt a lightness he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't a loud release, but an inner silence, as if he had completed the last page of a chapter that had been open for too long. He walked along the wet sidewalk, letting the raindrops touch his face, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was completely ready for what was to come next. That night, when he got home, he found Sophia organizing books on the bookshelf. She turned around when she heard him come in and, without saying anything, read everything in his eyes. She approached, touched his face gently and asked softly, is it over? He answered with a simple, yes, and hugged her tightly, with the intensity of someone who knows exactly where he wants to stay. It was not a hug of euphoria, it was a gesture of belonging. He was no longer struggling with the past. Now it was about building what comes next. And there, with a clean heart, he understood, he was no longer the betrayed man, the man who reacted. He was the man who survived and chose not to shrink in the face of pain. And that, in the end, was his greatest victory. Time moved forward with the same ruthlessness that brought all previous events, but also with the wisdom of cycles that need to end to make way for something new. The story between Daniel, Elena, Adam and Sophia left marks on each of them, some healed with maturity, others open as perpetual reminders of choices and consequences. The company, under new management, prospered with a more balanced, more ethical pace, with a more humane environment. Daniel, even having assumed the highest position of his career, kept his feet on the ground, refusing to be swallowed up by the vanity of power. He created a center within the organization focused on the emotional health of employees, bringing in specialists to prevent silent harassment and subtle ethical deviations that so many had previously preferred to ignore. For him, power was not synonymous with privilege, but with responsibility. He began to speak at conferences, not to talk about numbers or goals, but about personal limits and the importance of knowing when to leave a place where one is no longer seen or valued. Sophia, by his side, did not become a symbol, much less a trophy. She was a real partner. She continued in the legal sector, discreetly, without ever using her closeness to Daniel to benefit herself. She was the one who called him back when vanity threatened to infiltrate his decisions, who reminded him that the greatest risk for any successful man was to forget who he was before he succeeded. Their love grew without fanfare, without external applause, but with deep roots. They lived together for a while before deciding to make their relationship official in a small ceremony, surrounded only by a few friends, away from the spotlight. And in that ceremony, Daniel made a point of not making grand promises. He simply said that he would choose her every day. Sophia, in turn, said that she would be with him even in the most broken versions he would have. It was a pact of truths, not of perfection. And perhaps that is why it worked. Elena, on the other hand, followed a much more tortuous path. After her conversation with Daniel at the cafe, she spent weeks digesting every word. She understood, with bitterness and lucidity, that sometimes there is no going back. That certain decisions, however justified they may seem, simply break the line of what can be rebuilt. But she did not use this awareness to sink. She immersed herself in new projects, increasingly focused on emotional ethics in the workplace. Her name began to be linked to debates about integrity and reconstruction after public failures. For many, she became a reference in assumed vulnerability. Her texts circulated on the networks, her lectures filled auditoriums. But even with this recognition, there was an internal silence that never disappeared. Elena learned to live with it. Not as punishment, but as awareness. She married again a few years later, to a journalist she met during an interview about her mistakes. It was a different relationship, simpler, more down-to-earth. But deep down, she knew she would never love anyone the way she loved Daniel. And, most importantly, I knew that I would never love the same way again. Adam, on the other hand, met the end of the line in a very different tone. After his dismissal and the scandal that spread like wildfire, he tried to rebuild his image through consulting in side projects, but his damaged reputation did not recover. No one wanted to risk associating their brand with a man involved in improper relationships, internal manipulations, and covert abuse of power. His legal proceedings dragged on for years, and when he finally reached an agreement with the company, he had already lost practically all of the influential contacts he had. The last time he was seen publicly was in a short video on a small podcast, in which he spoke cynically about the hypocrisy of the corporate world and criticized the cancel culture. But his voice no longer mattered. It had become noise. A reminder of how an excessive ego can corrode everything that is built with the appearance of success. On the one-year anniversary of his appointment, Daniel organized an internal event for the company with the theme, "Rebuilding is also accepting that we were part of the problem." In his speech, he recalled the challenges, the lessons, and the importance of recognizing not only the mistakes of others, but also one's own silence in the face of mistakes. Sophia watched from the audience, proud. Elena, even from a distance, watched the online broadcast, with a glass of wine in her hand and a heavy heart. She knew that this story would affect her forever. Not with constant sadness, but with the kind of mark that transforms us into something more conscious. She closed her computer, looked out the window, and for the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. She knew that losing Daniel had been her biggest mistake, but also her biggest lesson. And so, each character reached their destination. Some taller, others more complete, some more lucid. But all changed. The betrayal was not the end. It was the catalyst. What really transformed these lives was what they did with what was left after the fall. Daniel didn't just survive. He won. And he won not by exposing others, but by refusing to hide. Elena lost more than she thought she could lose, but she also gained what she never imagined, herself. Adam, who believed himself to be untouchable, found himself reduced to the consequences of his own choices. And Sophia, it was unexpected. The woman who arrived after the pain, but who was not afraid to love what was still being remade. Now I want to know from you, what did you think of this story? What was the most impactful moment for you? Comment below, tell me your opinion, I read everything carefully. And if you got this far, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any new stories. Here, we do not support, romanticize or justify any type of betrayal. Our goal is to show, through fiction, how much betrayal can destroy, but also how much it is possible to rebuild with dignity. Until next time.